So for you personally, what comes to mind when you think of the Asia-Pacific War?
Well, it's not as taught as the European War during World War II. We hear, we learn about the Holocaust, about what happened in Europe, but we don't know about the millions who died in Asia. And the war crimes that happened. I think actually that was supposed to be the topic of our conference this year. But we're hoping to restart next year with the same topic, war crimes, because I think it's something that's not well known. It's not as known as the European war crimes. But it has been happening. I mean, it was happening since 1931.
Wait, what has been happening since 1931?
War crimes in the Pacific.
Yes, and not a lot of people know that, since most people, I think in America at least, think the war began in 1941.
No, it was not a sudden and deliberate act.
Yes, and the problem is that a lot of people don't know that.
Yes. No. It's 1931, so 10 years before Pearl Harbor. The United States was having economic sanctions against Japan since 1937, definitely. But even in Manchuria, after Manchuria, that's why Japan left the League of Nations, because they were being sanctioned. It was a long time coming, the war.
Yes, and what event would you consider to be the start of the Asia-Pacific War in 1931?
The Manchurian War. Yeah, when they invaded Manchuria.
Yes, and why do you consider that to be the start of the conflict rather than 1941, with like the bombing of Pearl Harbor, as most Americans think when the war started?
Well, because I think at that point, I guess Japan became imperialistic. Well, I guess they wanted Asia. Their slogan was Asia for Asians. They had what was called the Greater East Asia Prosperity Sphere, because all the Western countries were in China, in Asia, for economic reasons, not just in China, but, they were annexing different Pacific islands. So Japan, was a rising power. And then, well, even as early as 1894, when it defeated Russia during the Russo-Japanese War. So that was the first time that a Western power was defeated by an Asiatic country, an Asian country. But it's very complicated, and even within the Japanese hierarchy, it was, to study the what happened in Japan from 1894 to 1941. It's so complicated. Several prime ministers and ministers were assassinated, and it's such a complicated issue how the army became so militaristic, based on emperor worship, how they used the emperor. So it's quite complicated. But, in the end, it's all economic, it's all economic.
Yes, and actually, even before 1931, Japan was expanding into Asia, taking
Mhm.
annexing Korea, and also
Yeah, Formosa.
that was
In
before, but that was long before with like when Japan defeated China. So
yeah,
imperialist ambitions for a long time. So it's very ambiguous when you would say like the war and all the problems started.
yeah. Oh, sorry. 1894 was the first Sino-Japanese War, and 1904 was the Russo-Japanese War. So yeah, I mean they've had Formosa since 1895. Korea since what? Since 1905. So it's so complicated.
Yes.
Even Hawaii, they were vying for Hawaii in 1897, but I guess the United States got Hawaii first. So, and then during World War One, they were able to get the German colonies of the Marianas, the Marshall Islands, Carolinas. So it's a long, it's so many decades of yeah.
Yeah. But do you consider 1931 to be the start of the Asia Pacific War?
Well, I guess nonstop. It was like a continuous battle since 1931. Um, because that's when Japan started building up its, naval capabilities. There was a treaty in 1922, the Washington Naval Treaty, which was like a non-proliferation treaty. So it actually limited the buildup of the naval capabilities. But then when they got out of the League of Nations in 1933, they were able to build up their military capabilities without any hindrance. In the meantime, the United States was lagging behind. It was number 17th amongst the world's armies in 1938. So I guess the United States was not prepared to fight a war in two fronts. That's why they had to choose between the European theater or the Asian theater.
Yeah, and they chose. Did they choose the European?
Yes. So I think I mentioned to you there was this memo in November of 1940 written by Admiral Harold Stark. It was called Plan Dog Memo because that was the fourth option, Plan D. And that became the basis of the Allied War Plan, Rainbow Plan 5, which was discussed between January and April of 1941 between Britain, ABDA, American, British, Dutch, Australian conversations.
Yes. So by choosing Europe or adopting a Europe first strategy, did the U.S. basically put most of its forces and most of its
Yes,
supplies in
Europe. Yes.
And then, so what about the men fighting the Pacific? Were they basically like sort of abandoned by the government, or are they just given like whatever is left over?
Well, it appears that way with that policy because the United States had no choice, either because their interest they felt were more with the European theater, with Britain, Great Britain. If Great Britain is defeated, then it would be more difficult to, I guess, to save Europe.
Yes, but why? What are some factors that you think probably made the U.S. choose to put most of its energy or in Europe instead of the Pacific?
Well, I guess most of their economic interests would be in Europe. Their markets, maybe resources. Also, their people in the United States, majority of them descended from Europe. That's I don't know. That's how I feel about it. But mainly economic reasons.
But you
It's
also,
like in any war.
yes. But you also feel there probably might have been a racial component. You know, maybe the Americans felt, or the plight of the Europeans was much more immediate, and most Americans felt that it was more sympathetic because they were descendants from migrants from Europe, right? Or at least the majority of Americans at that time were.
Yeah, yeah, I would think there must be a racial component. President Manuel Quezon, who was the president of the Philippine Commonwealth during that time, because the Commonwealth had its own president, even though the Philippines was still not independent. But so anyway, he was so mad, and of course, the war plan. I mean, nobody knows about it except the top echelons, right? And he was so mad at the Americans because no help was coming during the early days of the war. And he actually wrote a letter to President Roosevelt, and he wanted to secede from the United States. He asked if they could give immediate independence to the Philippines so that they can become neutral, because he knew that no help was coming. And he was so upset about it because it's like, while we were helping the British, the Philippines, which was a colony of the United States, was not being saved. So even the priority of the Rainbow War plan, we were just number 3. Number 1 was to save the Malay Reef and Singapore. Singapore was part of Britain, right? But to save the Malay Reef, what's in the Malay Reef? All these oil wells were in the Malay Reef. So that was the number 1 priority. So when I was doing research and I was reading the diary of Admiral Thomas Hart, who was the commander-in-chief of the Asiatic Fleet, I couldn't understand why he left the Philippines on December 26, 1941. Why did he leave the Philippines? I mean, war was still going on, right? They hadn't surrendered yet. But those were his orders, because the priority is to save the Malay Reef. But then, actually, the British lost their flagship in Asia on December 10. So, I mean, at that point, I don't know, maybe it was already a losing battle for the Brits in Asia.
And who was number 2 priority if you said the Philippines is number 3?
Well, not exactly in countries, but in specific functions. I can't remember what the other one was, but the first one was to defend the Malay Reef. That was the Malay Reef, the Malay barrier, they call it. And number 3 was to give to keep the communications in the Philippines. Anyway, it was so bad.
Yes. And so, where would you say that you got most of the knowledge of that you currently know about the Asia Pacific War from? Like from school, from news?
No, actually, from documents. So a lot of these were, and a lot of these also were shared by fellow researchers. So most of them are primary documents from the National Archives. As I said before, I rely more on the primary documents, let's say military reports by the commanding officers, or primary documents, mostly reports, because they're unbiased. It's just a report, right? Because when you read a book, sometimes there's a bias, there's a spin.
So do you mean that you probably got most of the, you think that you got most of the knowledge that you currently know about the Asia Pacific War from your own research?
Well, there's reports. Yeah, they are reports.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you learn about it at all in school or from your family, or did they
No,
really give that much information?
no, no. As I said, it was a surprise to me to learn about what happened to my father's regiment during the last days of the war. And that was from from an analysis.
Yes. And you didn't learn about it in school at all when you were growing up?
No, they didn't teach us.
Did you learn anything about the European theater when you were growing up in the post-war era, or is that also not in textbooks?
No, no. Yeah, I mean, you read about it, but it wasn't taught in schools.
Yeah. And then what about media? Like, did you ever see any movies or read any books about the war?
Oh yeah, movies, but they're always distorted, right? So, I mean, looking back, I didn't know then, right? So
It was just entertainment for you before you actually began to research.
yes,